It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is Investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, Private Investigator Ed Opperman. You can find me at Opperman Investigations and Digital Forensic Consulting if you just email me at oppermaninvestigations@gmail.com. Our live show you could find at Spreaker.com. All of our archives, the past archives, all that kind of stuff you could find at Spreaker.com, where there's a chat room, you get an email notification when we put up new content. I play repeats there every Friday night. I play a live show there Friday night. And if you go there and look up Doug Poppa, Dougpoppa, the Doug Poppa podcast, I had him on previously talking about this crazy story. I tried to tell it myself about these judges and these pimps over there in Las Vegas, and I just didn't do it justice. But Doug Poppa has been all over that story for years and years and years. So I encourage people to go back there and find that. And we have him back today. Mr. Doug Poppa, are you there?
Good afternoon, Ed. Nice to be back.
Yeah, Doug, thank you so much. You can find Doug Poppa on his podcast on YouTube and also on Twitter at Doug Poppa Podcast on Twitter. So, Doug, remind the audience, who is Doug Poppa?
Well, I grew up in New York City, in Brooklyn. I joined the New York City Auxiliary Police Force. It was a volunteer program for 2 years. And then I was waiting to get on. I wanted to get on the police department, but in 75 they laid off I think 10, 15,000 cops, so that went down the drain. Ended up going into the U.S. Army Military Police Corps. Was in there for 3 years, got honorable discharge. Came out, was a police officer in the town of Herndon, Virginia. And then I switched over in 1980, July, to the Loudoun County Sheriff's Office. And then I worked patrol as a patrol deputy. And then I went into, I got promoted. I was in plain clothes for a while. And then I got promoted as an investigator, called him investigator, as a detective. And then I worked many years undercover. And then, long story short, and we could talk about it a little more later on, in 1992, I was fired by the sheriff because I exposed some misconduct and corruption on exculpatory evidence that was withheld from a gentleman's trial in 1988 who was charged with the attempted murder of his wife. And I testified at one trial. This was 4 years later. He was convicted and was in jail for over 4 years. And in 1991, I testified at the first part of a habeas corpus hearing that I had told the prosecutor and the captain in charge of the Criminal Investigation Division after this woman was shot that she had wanted to hire me as a bodyguard and told me that she would shoot herself if she could make it look like her husband did it, so we'd just spend the rest of his life in jail. I'd taken that comment out of context, so that's basically what she said. And then right after November 1991, I testified at, like I said, at that hearing, and then within 2 days, I was in the office with the sheriff telling me to keep my mouth shut and just getting attacked, and then the prosecutor started attacking me, the one that I told the information to before the trial, and he said he never spoke to me, and the captain said he never spoke to me. And the thing was on this, as Ed was, I had witnesses from 4 or 5 years ago that knew my involvement, and I never took the job with this woman because of what she said. She showed me the weapon, she showed me a gun and everything, and that's the gun she used that she supposedly shot with, her own gun. And it was the William Douglas Carter case. You can go on either my channel or even the internet and pick it up. Anyway, so I testified at the first hearing in November of 1991, and within 2 days, I was getting attacked by the sheriff. I was going to be fired, keep your mouth shut, open up a can of worms. I said, listen, I got witnesses that can corroborate what I said. He wasn't interested. He said, I spoke to the Commonwealth attorney. His name was William Birch. And I spoke to the captain. His name was Vernon Beamer. And he said, they both denied you ever spoke to him years ago. And I said, well, they're lying. I says, do an IA investigation. Put us on the polygraph. See who's telling the truth. Look at my witnesses. He said, I'm not doing nothing. This has nothing to do with us. It's between you and the Commonwealth attorney. And I said, well, I don't understand how that's possible, Sheriff, because Vernon Beamer is the captain. Birch is, the prosecutor, and I'm one of your investigators, one of your detectives. And he said, just keep your mouth shut if you want to keep your job. I didn't understand at the time, Ed, why he was telling me that he didn't want this thing to blow up. And after that, the prosecutor, Birch, and his deputy Commonwealth attorney, his name was James Forsyth, and this is all coming off the top of my head. I don't have any notes. It's like you live this like for the rest of your life. And they went out in the newspapers and basically accused me of being a perjurer, that I never told, Birch said I never told him anything. And then I went back to the sheriff and I said, what are you going to do about this? I need to respond. He says, you're not going to respond to nothing. You keep your mouth shut or I'll fire you. Well, nonsense. One of the reporters called me up from the first one was Leesburg Today. Her name was Carole Green. Said, do you want to talk? I said, absolutely. So that started this big battle in the newspapers, and every 2 or 3 days I was in the sheriff's office with the sheriff, the undersheriff, called the chief deputy. His name was Charlie Cooper, and the captain, another one of the captain, Jeff Brown, who was my supervisor when I was in, narcotics and stuff at CID, and just telling me, keep my mouth shut, and what are you doing? I said, I'm not doing anything. This guy may be innocent. They withheld exculpatory evidence. It never came in. Well, no, they said you didn't. I said, well, they're lying. So anyway, that went on, and I was getting a lot of harassment. I was getting phone calls and everything. So after Thanksgiving of 1991, I met with FBI agent. His name was Al Malachek. He was the resident agent. His office was at Dulles International Airport. And I had met with him and told him everything that happened, what I was going through. And, of course, he heard about it. This part was on the news, and, the news, Washington, D.C. news picked this up. And so I talked to him and told him everything. And it was sometime after that he said, well, when I spoke to him, he said, I'm going to forward this to headquarters, and which he did. And then sometime later, contact was made with 2 agents, Tom Fitzpatrick, and I can't remember the other agent's name off the top of my head right now, but they were with the Public Integrity Section out of Washington. Their office was actually in Falls Church, Virginia, and they were authorized to start an investigation. And that caused more problems for me, and I told them everything that I knew and talked about some other stuff they were asking me about. And then now we're in January of 1992. It was January 8th. Now, the big habeas corpus hearing is going to occur on January 8th. And still, right after I testified in November 91, a couple months later, I heard that the Virginia State Police were going to come out and conduct an investigation, based on what I said. So I was thinking, wow, this is going to be good. They can come out. They have authorization to put people on the polygraph. They've done that in other cases. They worked, with the sheriff's office. Excuse me. And so I was pretty happy. Well, that went down the tubes real fast. The agent came out with another agent and basically accused me of lying and making it up. And I said, listen, how can I make it up? But people from 4 years ago, a retired lieutenant, a federal probation officer, now a federal agent that works with Customs, was a sergeant on the department at the time. They knew. I met with this woman. I told them about stuff. They got to remember this. And he said, we're not talking to anybody. This is the state police guy. So an FU, out the door I go, and completely, disappointed, went home. And, by this time, I wasn't getting any sleep because, your whole life, your career is being destroyed and nobody's backing you up. But I couldn't understand why the sheriff did not want to conduct an IA investigation. So before the January 8th hearing in 1992, that was the big habeas corpus hearing in Loudoun County Circuit Court. I was talking to the new attorney for Mr. Carter, and he said, listen, I'm going to have my private investigator. The guy's name was Gary Gochenauer. He said, I'm going to have him come out and talk to you. So he came out to my apartment, Gary. He was a young guy, and he says, do you know what's going on here, Doug? And I said, yeah, I'm going to lose a 12-year career for doing absolutely nothing but telling the truth. And he says, well, I can't get into details because you're going to be a witness for us. But in essence, we're going to prove and bring out information that the sheriff perjured himself at Mr. Carter's trial, 4 or 5 years ago. And now it's all come to light. I said, really? He said, yeah. So here's my boss, the sheriff, the elected sheriff, John Isom. He was a retired captain from the Fairfax County Police Department. Told me he wasn't going to do an IA investigation. I was to keep my mouth shut. I was not to talk to the newspapers, even after I was getting attacked, like I said. And I couldn't understand why, like I said at the time. Now it was all falling in place. Because if he perjured himself at Carter's original trial, he knew, and he was telling me, you can open up a can of worms. Yeah, the can of worms will be coming back on him. So anyway, Mr. Gochenauer, the private investigator, tracked down all these witnesses that I had contact with years ago. A federal probation officer who was out in West Virginia. Ed was a sergeant at the time, and I was living with him after my divorce. At the time, I met Mrs. Carter, and he's now a federal agent at the time with the U.S. Customs. And then Bill Harris was a retired lieutenant. He was in Colorado. Anyway, they tracked them all down. And then January 8th, when the habeas corpus hearing came around, they were all subpoenaed. And they all testified and, backed up my recollection and stuff. And I testified on the stand, I think, for like a whole day, if not a day and a half. And just getting attacked by the Assistant Attorney General for the state of Virginia was handling the case, Robert Condon. And his boss was John Russell, the number one in charge of the criminal section of the Attorney General's office, because the prosecutor couldn't handle the case because of the allegations against him. So it was the Attorney General. So I was getting attacked on the stand 20 ways to Sunday. Told the truth, told them what I knew, just what I told you. And then Judge Sinclair, Arthur Sinclair, was a retired judge from Rappahannock County, I believe, who was called in back to service to handle the case, because they didn't want a judge in Loudoun to handle it because of the conflict. So anyway, long story short, I testified, other witnesses testified, my people that I said testified, Birch testified, the Commonwealth Attorney, Carter's wife testified, and everybody testified. So the judge came back the next day and said he was going to take about 2 weeks and review all the testimony. And during that 2-week period, Ed, they basically didn't do anything to me. Everything was like, I was still in narcotics, but nobody was working with me because my supervisor at the time, his name was Rocky, he said the sheriff has told everybody that if they talk to you, they work with you, he's going to fire them. And you got to remember, and I still think it's like this today, I don't know, this is 30 years ago, that at the time the sheriff was an elected official, a constitutional officer. And in Virginia, because we were the police department and the sheriff's department. We didn't have a police department, so we handled the patrol, the criminal investigations, the courts, the civil process, the whole gamut. But because we worked for an elected sheriff, we couldn't belong to a collective bargaining union. Our county was not civil service, and technically under the code at the time, the sheriff can hire and fire anybody he wanted at will. He can come in tomorrow and say, you're all fired, you're uncommissioned, and put in all his friends, and there's nothing they can do about it. So that was the problem when my attorney, John Flannery, he was a former AUSA out of New York City, he's a criminal defense attorney in Virginia. He took my case pro bono because I couldn't afford an attorney, and he was putting all kind of motions in, but because of that status with the sheriff, wrongful termination, everything, nobody could force him to put anybody back to work. So that didn't go. But anyway, go back to Judge Sinclair now said he was going to do 2 weeks, and then he did. But during that 2-week period, Ed, nobody bothered me. They left me alone. Before that, I was in the sheriff's office almost every other day, getting slammed and threatened with demotion. And they actually end up, demoting me from detective investigator to civil process. That's all on these news clips that are on my podcast and stuff you could see. So 2 weeks later, the judge comes back with his decision. Everybody's in the courtroom's packed. All the news was out there. There was satellite trucks outside. And in comes the sheriff and the chief deputy and the captains, and I'm standing against the wall because it was standing room only, and they looked at me like with a smirk on their face, because I was told by one of my people who were talking to me that when the judge comes back with the decision and says that Carter remains in prison, doesn't get a new trial, and basically he loses the habeas corpus motion, they're going to go after you for perjury. And I didn't perjure him, I told the truth, but that's just how corrupt the system was at the time. So I'm thinking, well, Jesus, but I told the truth. What can you do? So they come in, courtroom was packed. They're all giving me like smirks. And so I just stood there. I didn't say nothing. I was on the side of the wall, because it was standing room only in the courtroom by this time. And Sinclair came out, did a bunch of legal stuff he was talking about. And I remember when he said this comment, all their heads went down into their lap. And I have the written decision. You can see it on my podcast, and I think I posted on Twitter a couple of times. And when he came out and he said this from the bench, he says, after reviewing the testimony and all the witnesses, he made this comment, and their heads went down into their lap. He said, this court has to make a decision that it would rather not make, which means he was going against the entire criminal justice system, the Commonwealth Attorney's Office and the Sheriff's Office. And then he read that, I'm taking this out of context, I don't have it, and then he said, after reviewing everything, I find the testimony of Investigator Poppa credible, backed up by credible witnesses. Mr. Carter needs to be immediately released from state prison and given a new trial where this time all the evidence can be produced. And they went out of the courtroom so fast, and I went outside, and there was satellite charges getting interviewed. You see this on on my podcasts and stuff that's posted on YouTube. And I was getting interviewed and stuff, and I'm thinking, okay, now somebody has to come in and do an investigation of why this thing was covered up, why they were threatening me. And, I told the truth, and the judge said I told the truth. And it didn't. It got progressively worse. And that was in February of 1992 when Judge Sinclair came down with his decision. And I'm thinking now everything's going to get better, but it didn't. It got progressively worse. They demoted me from detective investigator to civil process, and then they end up firing me in April of 1992 for continually talking to the newspapers. Inside Edition came out in February and did a story on me, and they would tell me, you keep doing this, you're going to get fired. And then 60 Minutes producer, Howard Rosenberg, got a hold of my attorney, and they came out and interviewed me for a spinoff at the time. It was going to be on the premiere episode. It was called Street Stories with Ed Bradley. It was a 60-minute spinoff, and the sheriff had found out that they were up there for a week and they were at my home. So when he found that out, I'm back in the office. He says, "What are you talking to 60 Minutes about?" And I said, "None of your freaking business." But Ed, when I said I went to the FBI in 1991, it was like the next day he found out that I went to the FBI. I don't know how, but he found out, okay? And I was pulled into his office with the chief deputy, and he said, I want to know what you told the FBI. Because there was a lot of other crazy stuff that was going on in the sheriff's department for years, missing evidence, missing narcotics, and a bunch of stuff, asset forfeiture money that we couldn't use. They were storing it in the bank and everything. And I said, I can't tell you. And he said, I want to know what you told the FBI. So I took out a piece of paper from my notepad, and I wrote down the agent's name, and I threw it on his desk. And I said, that's the agent's phone number. Call him up and talk to him yourself. And I walked out. And before I walked out, he says, you think you're a smartass. And he was effing, throwing F-bombs and everything. He says, you work for me. And technically I did. But I said, no, I work for the people of the county. But technically I did work for him, and he could fire me. But he knew if he did that at the time, that it was just going to blow everything worse. And he said, you just better, he was cussing me out, and I had some choice words with him, and I walked out. And that's because he found out I went to the FBI. So now the decision comes down, and I'm thinking, okay, this is going to be okay. Everything's going to cool down, and it didn't. The threats of being fired and running my mouth and keep your mouth shut, and I didn't. And I hadn't, like I said, my attorney, John Flannery, every time they said something to me, he was also talking to the news, and he was doing a lot of motions to try to fight, so the transfer and stuff, and it didn't do any good. And but he did a lot of work on it. He's on now. I see him on MSNBC a lot of times. He's on the Ari Melba show. He's a criminal defense. His name is John Flannery, great attorney. How that came about, Ed. I didn't have money because people say you need to get an attorney, Doug, because you're going to lose your job, 12-year career. I didn't have money. I was a cop, and so one of the reporters called me up and said, "Why don't you call John Flannery?" And I knew John. I've seen him in court many times. He was a great defense attorney. He was a bulldog. He grew up in Bronx, New York City, and he was a former assistant United States attorney for the Southern District, in New York. And I can't afford John. He said, well, call him up. So I called him up on the phone one day, long story short, and he says, Doug Poppa, I've been looking at everything that's going on. He goes, why don't you come up to my office tomorrow? And I went up to his office, and I was outside of Leesburg, and he shook my hand, and he said to me, do you have $1 on you? I said, yeah. He goes, give me $1. I didn't know what he was doing, right? I gave him $1. And he shook my hand. He goes, I'm now your attorney. I'll give him hell. So he did whatever he could, but like I said, with that constitutional, the sheriff being elected official, but he just gave him hell. He was in the papers all the time talking, and like I said, the news media in Washington D.C. Got in on it. And the only reason why they did is because, and I said this in a couple of my podcasts, A lot of the news media these days are a bunch of freaking cowards, especially when it comes to police corruption or police misconduct. They don't want to go after the police department. And that's sad because a lot of these cops that, to this day, that come out and expose this stuff, they don't really get the backing many times from the press. But now we're going back 30 years to 1991, 1992, when all this was going on with me. And right after when I said Carole Green, that reporter, had called me up, she was with the newspaper at the time called Leesburg Today. The founder and editor at the time founded his paper. I'm trying to think of the guy. So many names in here. I'm losing his name. I don't want to lose this guy's name because if it wasn't for him, none of this would ever happen. When I met with him and Brett Phillips, his name was, and Carole Green, his reporter, they vetted me for like 2 days. They were asking me all kinds of questions on my background and what witnesses I had and everything. And he was the first one that started attacking the sheriff and the Commonwealth attorney in his articles. And Carole Green was relentless going after them, but he was the editor, he was the founder, the publisher, and they're publishing this stuff. And then because of the stories he was doing, the Loudoun Times-Mirror, the big paper in the county, got involved, and then the Washington Post got involved. And then that just went viral with the news, the television stations in the Washington, D.C. area, and that prompted Inside Edition to come out and interview me in 1992 after I testified. And then I think that came before I testified, and then they were there after too. And then, of course, the street stories. So, but I ended up getting fired in April of '92 for insubordination, for continually talking to the press, and it was just a bunch of BS. And you got to understand, at this time I was a zombie. I wasn't getting any sleep. I was depressed. It was like my whole world was coming down. And long story short is I can never get, I'm fast forwarding out after this, but I can never get back on a police department, a law enforcement agency in this country because of what I did. Because you have to put down, why you were fired.
Right.
You have to explain why you were fired. And you either don't hear from them or they say they considered other applicants. And with police departments all over the country for a long time I was applying for and could never get back into law enforcement. But get back to 1992, and this is, I know we were only like an hour, so I got to get this into a nutshell. But in May of 1992, after I got fired, I got approached by a lieutenant. His name was Don Moore on the sheriff's office. And when I say sheriff's office, we were the police department for the county. We didn't have a police department. And then he called me up one day, and my buddy, who I worked narcotics with, that got promoted to sergeant, his name was Pete Becerra. He died of cancer a couple of years ago. And he was over there. We were eating lunch. He brought some sandwiches over. And then Don calls up, and he says, "Doug, I'm in the area. Can I come over?" But he didn't know Pete was there, and Pete's cruiser, Mark Cruiser, was outside. So he comes over, and you got to remember, now there's a uniformed sergeant sitting there. And he says, "What are you doing for money?" And at this time, I said, "I'm working with a defense attorney looking into another murder case." And he said, "Well," this is what he says right in front of this other cop. And he says, "I'm involved with some ex-cops from New York and New Jersey, and we're getting ready to kidnap one of the heirs to the DuPont fortune." And I looked at him.
Wait, we're getting ready to kidnap who?
One of the heirs to the DuPont fortune,
okay.
The DuPont Chemical Corporation. And I looked at him, and Pete looked at him, and my mouth, I said, "What did you say?" He goes, "I'm involved with some ex-cops from New York and New Jersey and some other people. We're getting ready to kidnap one of the heirs to the DuPont Chemical fortune." So he relays this crazy freaking story that, this is not a kid. This is a guy like in his 30s, and they had kidnapped him and his wife because he gets like $100,000, one of like the 1,000 heirs to the DuPont fortune. He gets all this money every month, and he's given his money to this guy that ran for president years ago, Lyndon LaRouche.
Sure. Okay.
And the father didn't like the idea that he was given this money and he was associated with LaRouche, and he's talking all this crazy stuff. He goes, "We got to deprogram." I never heard that word before. Yeah. He says, "We got to deprogram her, and we're going to kidnap them and deprogram them to the right way of thinking." And I'm looking like, "What do you want to do with me?" He goes, "Well, we can pay you because of your surveillance experience, because we need to put him under surveillance. You know how to do all that stuff. And so he's naming names: Galen Kelly, an attorney, Bob Point, Tony Russo, ex-New York City cop. Bob Point was an ex-South Amboy cop who became an attorney. Galen Kelly is the programmer. And I'm looking at him, and Pete's looking at him like, what the hell? So he says, what do you think? Now, you got to understand at this time, the FBI was already conducting a corruption investigation. They were already looking into the sheriff's office because of everything that I told them and other stuff that came on that they were looking. It got so involved with them. But anyway, so he says, what do you think? And I said, well, can I have some time to think about it? He said, yeah. So he leaves. Pete looks at me and says, what the hell is he talking about? And well, that's not what he said, but I don't want to cuss on the show. And I said, Pete, do you trust me? And he said, yeah, I trust you with my life. Because I worked undercover with Pete, when he was on, and he got promoted to sergeant, back in uniform. And he says, yeah. And I says, do me a favor, forget this ever happened. Don't talk to anybody about it. And he just looked at him and he says, why? I says, you trust me, right? He said, yeah. So he leaves, right? The minute Pete left, I'm on the phone with Scott Sutherland. That's the other agent I couldn't remember who was with the public integrity section who was doing the investigation on the sheriff's office with his partner, Tom Fitzpatrick. And I call him up and I relay what Don Moore just told me. And he says, Doug, it sounds crazy, but we'll look into it.
Oh, wait, real quick. These were on-duty active cops doing this kidnapping plot.
No. Well, okay. When Don came over, he tells me that the sheriff fired him yesterday. Okay, because Don wanted to run against him against him at the next election, and he said he found me. Somebody said he found me in his office. The secretary said so. He fired me. So I'm thinking, okay, this sounds like a setup to get me involved with the kidnapping, or maybe Don was being. I didn't know, right? So yeah, I said he fired. Yeah, the sheriff fired me. So anyway, boom. So he leaves. Like I said, I'm on the phone with Scott Sutherland from the FBI. And I tell him all this, and he thinks, Doug, it sounds like it's crazy. He says, but we'll look into it. Well, the next morning, Scott calls up. It's like 7 o'clock. He says, what are you doing? And I said, I'm getting ready to go in the shower because I got to go to this attorney's office. I was doing some work with them because I had to get work as a defense investigator to look into this other murder case. And he says, no, you can't go anywhere. He says, there's a couple agents from headquarters coming out. They're going to talk to you. He goes, Doug, this is not BS. These guys have been doing kidnappings for a long time, and they'll explain everything when they get there. So I'm thinking, Jesus. So I think there was 4 agents came out, a female and 3 guys came up to my apartment, and I had to explain everything again, what I explained to you, and they asked me some questions. And they said, well, how did you leave it with Don? I said, well, just like I told you. I said, let me think about it. And he said, listen, we want you to go undercover for us and infiltrate this group. These are guys who have been doing kidnappings and never been charged federally. And now I'm thinking, great, now I'm going to feel like a cop again, right? Undercover work was my thing. So I call up John Flannery, my attorney. All the FBI agents were there. And John says to me, well, I won't say exactly what he said because I can't curse, but he says, are you freaking crazy? You got drug dealers hate your guts. You got cops going after you. You're in the middle of this other thing. He says, no, absolutely not. Don't do it. And I said, John, I already told them I would do it. I knew you were going to say that. They'll call me back when they leave. So they've heard all this. The agents were there. So anyway, long story short, they said, you have, and I did. I had a recorder on my phone because everything that was going on. They said, record everything between you and Don until we get the Title III, the wiretap up on all your phone, all these phones. And so I did. I called Don back and told him I was interested because I needed the money. And that was around now.
How much were they going to pay?
He said they were going to pay me like $500 a day. And he did give me money once, and I had to turn that over to the FBI. And but anyway, I did. And then it ended up going to a 3-month undercover operation where we were traveling back and forth to Pennsylvania.
Any compensation from the FBI?
Well, let me get that. That'll come after it. So anyway, we're on this. Well, they said they were going to pay me what I was making on the sheriff's office. But to me it was like, okay, that's fine. But to me it was like be a cop again. I'd be even though I wasn't an FBI agent, but I'd be working on this because I love undercover work. And plus, I didn't know if Moore was setting me up with the sheriff, for a federal kidnapping and stuff. So I did, and that went June, July, August, September, and in that 3-4 month period, I met the father who was financing it. Ended up meeting the programmer Galen Kelly, and the attorney, the cop turned attorney, and I never met this retired New York City cop, and his name was Tony Russo. I never did meet him. But anyway, so every time I met with these guys, the FBI had set hidden recorders in my van. They gave me body wire transmitters and hidden recorders to use when I met these guys over this 4-month period, and which I did. I made 60 hours of what we call consensual body wire and transmitter tapes, and I think they had 100 hours of Title III tapes when the case finished, after I finished the undercover investigation, and they locked up all these people and stuff. But so they flew me. They wanted me to get out of Loudoun because they thought that it was dangerous for me to be there. So there's another long story. So I went out to Denver, where the Denver office was supposed to set me up with an apartment and stuff. And this was a crazy freaking story. And because, I still had the trial hadn't come up yet. So they were going to fly me back to, the Eastern District of Virginia and everything. So when I got to Denver, I called the agent up from the Denver office, who the agents that were working the kidnapping case told me that they would set me, I'd be like a witness, and they would take care of me while they fly me back. So I called this guy up. He's like, he didn't know the hell I was talking about. And he says, what are you talking about? And I says, well, I'm here. I'm at the Holiday Inn at the airport. And he goes, mister, I don't know what you're talking about. He goes, wait a minute. He goes, he's like shuffling papers around. I hear on the phone. He goes, oh, yeah, I see something over here from the WFO, the Washington Field office, whatever. And he says to me, where are you at? I said, I'm in Denver. I'm at the airport. I'm at the Holiday Inn. It was Holiday Inn I was at. He goes, when did you testify? I said, testify in what? He goes, when did you testify against these guys? I said, I didn't testify anybody. They just locked them up like a couple of days ago. I'm out here in Denver because you guys are supposed to set me up because they didn't want me to be like, in Loudoun. He goes, the Washington Field office sent you half across the country by yourself?
Yeah, right.
You didn't testify yet, and they want us to be responsible for your safety? He goes, buddy, I feel sorry for you. You need to call him back. We're not getting involved with this. Click, he hangs up the phone. And I'm like, and this time my girlfriend was with me at the time, the girl I was dating. And I'm like, what the hell's going on? Long story short, I call them back, and they tell me, hey, you got your undercover, because I had an undercover legend, a driver's license with a different name on it was undercover. I said, yeah. And they said, listen, they give me some money, go get an apartment under that name. I said, that's not going to work, because when they do a credit check, it's all going to come back. It doesn't exist. The Social Security number wouldn't exist. My name wasn't exist. We'll try it anyway. And that turned into a cluster. And I end up having to tell the resident manager where I was living at the time, I said, listen, I need this thing. And I told her this crazy story. And she says, well, I can get something from the FBI in Washington. We'll do this under an anonymous name. So they did. They sent the thing and said, he is what he is. He's put on the name. And then the U.S. attorney came out, and they work a deal and all this stuff. And by this time, I'm like pissed, right? Because they treat me like I'm a piece of crap. Anyway, so that's what happened. I did end up testifying at the federal trial. It's a long story. We could do a whole podcast on this. Excuse me, I just hit the mic. They were all found not guilty. Okay, and then they were retried. So the father was, because they tried them all together, and I guess the jury said that they felt sorry for the father, that if it was my son was given all this money, so they were all found not guilty. They retried everybody except the attorney, the cop turned attorney, and they were found guilty on other kidnappings. Because during this time, and this is great, Ed, I got to get this out, and I talked about this on a podcast like a year or two ago. You got to remember, when I'm traveling with Dawn now from Virginia to Pennsylvania to South Amboy, New Jersey, meeting all these guys, I got recorders going in my gym bag was hidden. Like I had transmitters on when I was walking to the attorney's office, and I made all these tapes, right? And it was funny because when I walked into the attorney's office in Jersey, he was saying, some agent came in, some time ago and was asking me if I knew anything about this, that. He goes, they're freaking stupid. He says, the FBI would never, send anybody in here with a freaking wire on because I'm an attorney, which is bullshit. If you're an attorney involved in criminal activity, of course they can do what they have to do. Then while he's telling me this, I got the freaking transmitter and recorder, the Panasonic RN36 slimline recorder in my pocket, two as a backup, right? And the agents told me they had a whole surveillance team on me every time I traveled out of Virginia. They have like a civilian, and these guys are good. They're civilians, but they don't look like they do good. They follow you around, and you don't even know they're following you, right? So when I first went I said, listen, I'm going to meet with the attorney. This is the first time. And he said, they said to me, do not be wired. Don't have a recorder. Because if they pat you down, you can, the shit's going to hit, excuse me, beep that out later. It's going to hit the fan. So I said, listen, this is the first time I'm going to meet. I'm going to be wired. And if anything hits the fan, then you guys come in. So when I got out of the car that morning in South Amboy, New Jersey, and this guy had like a storefront, a lawyer's office, the street was completely dead. I didn't see anybody around. So I'm thinking, well, maybe they lost me or something, right? The surveillance team, the FBI surveillance team. So I turned and I had all this set up before we got there. I had the Panasonic RN36 in my pocket. I had the body wire I put on me down in my groin and stuff, and I did it all myself. So I turned it on because now, I don't want to save the batteries. And I said, okay, we're here. I don't know if I don't see anybody around, but if you guys can hear me beep a horn, and way off in the distance I hear beep. So wherever they were, they had the transmitter and they knew. And then I went in and I met the attorney and then this deprogrammer named Galen, and he comes out, he shakes my hand. This is great. And he says, Don Moore's told me a lot about you. And he says, and yeah, you're working with the FBI to try to get that corrupt sheriff. These are the guys involved in criminal activity, right?
Right.
So I'm thinking, okay, if they pat me down, I'm going to fight and I'll throw something through the window and go out and these guys will come in and back me up. But it didn't happen. They sat there and said, this is great. And they started talking about all these other kidnappings they were doing for years. This is all on tape, okay? And that's some of the stuff that they used at the next trials that they won. They're talking about, they kidnapped this girl out of D.C. coming out of the CNN building, and they wrapped her up in a van and a blanket. They took her to Loudoun County, and they found out when they got there that it was the wrong girl.
Oh, my God.
And they took her back to Washington and said, if you talk to the FBI or the police, we know where you're at. They threatened her. And this is Galen Kelly and some other people. And so before they left, she had a thermos in her hand. This girl was smart. And she says, give me my effing thermos. So Kelly, the idiot, throws the thermos at her. Of course, as soon as they leave, this happened in Washington, D.C., she calls the Washington Metropolitan Police Department, and then they call the FBI. So they had that case that was going on. Then there was another case they were talking about where this was in New York now, where they went into some hotel because this is crazy stuff, okay? And the reason why they were kidnapping the girl is because, and these weren't kids, these were adults, is because the family found out she was in a lesbian relationship.
Oh, wow.
And didn't want it. So they wanted these people to kidnap her and deprogramming into the correct way of thinking. So that's what these guys were doing. They worked for a group at the time. There was some group called the Cult Awareness Network. It doesn't exist anymore. So they're talking about all this stuff on the tape. And then they talk about another case, talk about a lot of cases, but the other case they were talking about is they did another kidnapping up in upstate New York where they kidnapped this girl, and I think they were dressed as cops when they went in, if I remember correctly, but I don't know. Anyway, they went into this hotel room, and they tied the boyfriend up, and they kidnapped the girl. And then they took her to upstate New York where this guy Galen lived. I think it was around Kingston, New York. And they had her there for a couple of days, and they were trying to deprogram her. And the reason why they're doing that, they got to listen to this. This is crazy stuff, but it's all true.
Yeah.
One of them, and I don't know which one. One was Catholic and one was Jewish. One of the parents didn't like the idea that there was just going to be this marriage, and they were in a different faith. So they hired these idiots through the Cult Awareness Network to kidnap.
What year was this? What year was this?
Okay, this was all going on. Well, when that happened, when they're telling me on the recording all this stuff,
yeah.
This is in 1992. So this stuff happened a year or 2 years before. But they were open cases, okay, that the Bureau had. And I had to be careful because, when you're you don't want to trap anybody. And I know that as a cop working undercover. And being that I was an agent technically of the FBI, because I was doing the infiltration for them, I played completely stupid on these tapes. And so bad, and that Don Moore would tell me on these tapes when we were driving, you know, Doug, I didn't think you were a stupid MF, okay? This stupid. Because I didn't want to say anything. He would say something like to me, this was great. This is great. I got to get this out. Because he would say, what time he said to me, do you know what COINTELPRO is? Yeah, I know what the COINTEL is, a counterintelligence program for the FBI. But I said to him, no, because I just wanted to play stupid. I wanted him to say what he's going to say. So he goes into this tirade. He goes, now Don Moore was lieutenant on the sheriff's office, okay? He was assigned, taken out of the sheriff's office years before, and went to Boston and was sworn in as a U.S. Marshal, Deputy U.S. Marshal, Special Deputy, to work with the FBI on the LaRouche investigation that started in Boston, the LaRouche organization. And they also was involved in the Virginia investigation when they went after LaRouche and a bunch of his people for, I think, credit card fraud and everything. Yeah. So he was sworn in and he was working with the FBI. But now he's talking about that while I'm recording him in the car, okay? And then like every hour, he says to me, what the hell's the matter with your damn kidneys? And he goes, this guy is stupid. He goes, what's in that effing bag? Because I always had this gym bag that the FBI gave me that hidden Naga recorder in it. And I had all these extra tapes and batteries, right? So